This is Paul Valteau interviewed by Dr. Raphael Casimir, June 28th, 2004, at the Midlow Center at the University of New Orleans as part of the Dutch Morial Mayoralty Oral History Project.
Ready? Okay, we have an interview on Monday, June 28 with Sheriff Paul Valteau about his involvement with Dutch Morial. First, tell us something about your own background, your family, education, where you lived in New Orleans.
Born and raised here, grew up uptown on Soniat Street originally, and then in my later years on LaSalle, right off Napoleon. Went to local schools here, St. Vincent High School, Dillard University, Loyola Law School. I also went to the University of Cincinnati for a short period. Got involved in politics as an outgrowth of my involvement in the civil rights movement way back. When I was in high school, I spent a couple of summers doing voter registration stuff for the Greater New Orleans Coordinating Council.
Okay.
Worked in fact, I have very fond memories of sitting in the Calliope Housing Project teaching a woman how to register to vote and watching with her Dr. Martin Luther King's speech on the March on Washington.
Okay.
We were working, registering people in the Calliope Project, the Magnolia Project, and the areas around those two project areas, and then the tough job of getting them, once you taught them how to register, getting them to
Almost
come out
impossible.
to take the bus on Friday to go down to City Hall and actually attempt to register. Back
I'm
then
glad you mentioned attempt.
with AP Tim Galleyhouse there and his crew, it was a situation where you would have to go usually 4 or 5 times before you actually got registered, and you would get denied for any reason, from you wore the wrong color shirt to you could not interpret the preamble of the Constitution. So it was a very interesting work that I did. It was enjoyable. Also participated in a few demonstrations in the Central Business District, picketing and that kind of stuff. So as an outgrowth of that, I had an interest in law, and that while I was at Dillard University, one of the political science professors approached me about going to law school in my junior year. At that point, I really didn't know what I was going to do when I finished. I took the entrance exam and apparently did fairly well on it. I received offers from a number of schools, and I think I had decided to go to Notre Dame, and I went to Cincinnati to a summer program to prep us for Notre Dame. And after I looked at the campus a lot, didn't particularly like it. I've been accepted to all 3 of the universities in Louisiana, and I decided to come back home after one semester.
Why Loyola?
Because Loyola gave me the biggest scholarship.
Oh, smart man. All right.
I'll tell you an interesting story about that. I entered the class, and it was myself and another fellow who had gone to Dillard with me. We both graduated at the same time, named Richard Stewart. His brother is now on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals.
James.
Yeah.
James, Richard, and Cole.
Right. Well, actually, Carl is on the Fifth Circuit
Right.
Court of Appeals. James is a judge in
Shreveport.
Shreveport,
I
yeah.
taught James.
So Richard, the oldest brother, and I went to school together. So we entered law school. We were only 2 African Americans in the class of about 134. And that was during the height of the Vietnam War. My draft board was New Orleans. His draft board was Shreveport. In the first few months that we were there, 2 people got drafted out of the class, him and me. And they tell us that it was a blind system.
Okay.
So Richard went on and volunteered. I was able to finagle my way out of it. And Richard did a number of years and worked his way up to, I think, colonel.
Yeah, he is.
And retired in the JAG Corps, and he went on and got his law degree while he was in the Navy, and retired from the JAG Corps as a colonel, and went to work in private industry. Lives in Dallas now. So anyway, after I graduated, I had a Reginald Hubert Smith Fellowship, and I did that for a year and a half, and then I was offered an opportunity to go to work for the Louisiana legislature, which I did. and did that for 3 years as an attorney for the committee that was the joint legislative committee that was studying juvenile laws. And
Okay.
we redrafted quite a bit of legislation, and I needed a place to have an office to practice law, to get mail, to deal with people. So I was invited by then Louis Gerty's and Overton Theory to come and hang out my shingle there, and I did. Dutch had just left the firm recently, I guess he had left it a few years earlier when he got appointed to juvenile court and then
Right.
ran for the Fourth Circuit. But Dutch would often come by and visit us on his way home.
Well, when did you first meet him? When you were working for the committee?
Actually, no. I met him way back in the '60s when he attempted to. Well, I guess he got elected when he got elected to the legislature in the late
67.
1960s. Yeah. I was familiar with it. I'll never forget something that I read in the newspaper. I guess it was one of the things that kind of also had an influence on me going into law was I remember he was one of the first people to file a lawsuit against the tobacco companies way back in the '60s. And I remember the headlines on Louisiana Weekly, lawyer filed suit. I remember people were looking at it and saying, oh man, this guy's crazy, he's never gonna. And I always thought, I said, there could be something there, that might be. And so I was always impressed with the fact that he was a fairly independent fellow.
Right.
He marched to his own drum, and he didn't listen to the crowd and follow anybody.
But you mentioned something, I had forgotten about that. He was militantly anti-smoker.
Yes.
I remember before it was legal, I guess, to
Yeah.
ban smoking in public buildings. You dare not go in his office smoking.
Yeah.
City
Well,
councilman, average citizen,
Anybody, yeah.
you couldn't
Well, he
do
was
it.
an asthmatic, and
Right.
my mother was an asthmatic. She died from asthma just like he did, and I know why. He was
Right.
militantly anti-smoking. So
Well, that must have been right after the first Surgeon General's report
yeah, around
in the mid-'60s.
1966.
Right.
Yeah.
I had forgotten
Absolutely,
about that,
yeah.
but I remember about that, and I say,
Yeah.
But had
So-
you known worked with him in any other
No,
capacity before?
I hadn't really. I guess we developed a relationship as a result of me going into the office, and he would come by in the
Right.
evenings, and we'd shoot the breeze, talk about a lot of things. And at the time, I was representing a guy named Bates, who was the coach of the Southern University football team,
Okay.
and who I'd met while I was in Baton Rouge. And Bates had invited us to the Southern University banquet at which Muhammad Ali would be speaking. So
Yeah.
Dutch and I went up to the banquet.
Because he used to love
And-
boxing.
Yeah, oh yeah. And I liked it too. My dad used to take me when I was a kid to the Coliseum
Coliseum
and
Arena,
see,
all
yeah,
right.
and see
Dating
boxing
yourself,
matches.
boy.
Yeah. So we went. We had a great time. We met Ali. We talked a bit, and we even talked about the possibility of putting on a match in the Superdome. And actually, the Chuck Wepner fight
Okay.
we were trying to get. And at the time, we didn't realize we were in competition with Don King, and
okay.
we were no match for Don King. So Don King won on that issue, but we spent a couple of months trying to put it together and trying to raise the seed money that we would need to do it, and it just didn't work out. From there, I guess the relationship continued to develop, and it was a good one. We both enjoyed the company of each other and talking about things that affected the city and things on a national level. And
Did you learn much from him from his past experience as a civil rights attorney?
Absolutely. We always talked about that. He always talked about relationships, lawsuits that he was involved in, contacts that he made throughout the country. In fact, I took a number of trips with him to activities, to conventions, and to meetings and things like that, and got exposed to a lot of things that I would not have been exposed to otherwise. So he was a great mentor, no question about it.
He was really a teacher. He used to love to teach.
Absolutely.
And one thing I found about him, and it was true of Chapatal and Truro, they were not at all reluctant to divulge what a lot of people have thought would have been secretive information.
Yeah.
If they had confidence in you,
Right. Yeah.
they'd
Oh,
teach.
Yeah. Absolutely. He was really a very strong in that area. He loved to share information,
Right.
loved to talk about things, loved to expose you to things
Right.
that you had not been exposed to, and I certainly benefited greatly from it. I guess, as I think back about it, long about the winter of 1976, he came to me one day and he said, I'm thinking about running for mayor. And I said, really? He says, I can't make the decision until we have a poll. And we gotta talk about and figure out how to do a poll, and we gotta do it as cheaply as we can. So he called Ed Renwick and met with Ed Renwick and talked about it, and Ed Renwick gave him a cut rate number and a real good price. And the only problem was Renwick didn't have the list of voters to call to randomly select. So Ed Renwick did not have a list with phone numbers on it. So what we did was early in '77, like in January, Dutch got the list from the Registered Voters Office. Didn't have phone numbers on it.
Okay.
And myself, my wife, my mother, father, my several other relatives, and some friends of Dutch, we used to sit in the law office at nights and on weekends and go down that list and look up people's phone numbers until we needed to get 1,500 phone numbers that were accurate. And so we spent till about March of that year working in the law office at night and on weekends looking up phone numbers to put together a list that had phone numbers and names of registered voters so that Ed Renwick could do the poll. And once that was completed, Renwick did the poll, and the numbers came back very encouraging. And from there, he just moved into the arena. We had, of course, obviously, we had some meetings, and we talked about the issues relating to him being a judge and running for an office that was a non-judicial office, which was prohibited by the Constitution. And we formed a legal team, and which was composed of Bill Jefferson, Trevor Bryant, Louis Gerty, Don Bernard, myself, David Marcello, and we began to look at the issues and see what we would have to do to file litigation. And at the appropriate time, litigation was filed, and that allowed him to move forward with his qualification and attempt to run.
Now, did he win at the district court level and lost on the appeals?
I think he did, yes, but I'd have to check again.
Okay.
I think he did win at the district court level and lost on the appeal. And the matter was ultimately appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court,
Right.
Where it was denied writs.
Right.
But once the campaign got started, several of us peeled away from that from the litigation, and it was pretty much left up to David and Jeff and Trevor, who handled the litigation, and Louis, who actually did the work on litigation once, because by that point the campaign had started, and we were busy. The rest of us were busy doing other things, getting the campaign moving. I remember it was a very low budget campaign at the beginning.
I remember that.
We operated out of the Claver building, and I can remember the very first fundraiser we had, and if my recollection is correct, I think we raised about $6,000 in the first fundraiser, and that was because Philip Baptiste got up and passed the hat. We had a little wine and cheese reception at the Claver. Do you remember the meeting?
Yeah, I remember that.
Building?
Yeah,
And,
I remember that reception.
We had about 25 people there, and nothing on the invite said that we were going to do a fundraiser, but after everybody was there for a while and had some wine and drink and had some sandwiches and some cheese, Philip got up and insisted that people needed to contribute money, and so we raised a few dollars there. I remember he came in. You remember the old wooden Coke containers?
Yeah.
He came in one day with that, and he said, and he had this little orange card that was printed up where you gave out to people. He would give them out. He had them with him all the time. Everybody had to carry them with them all the time, and you'd give them out, and people would fill in and say, I want to put a sign in my lawn, I want some material to pass out, I want this or that. And so one day he brought that Coke thing in, and he says, "This is going to be our filing cabinet." I looked at him, I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "We've got, we'll start with A, B, C, D, E, F, G." There were 24 slots
Right.
in that, and there are 26 letters in the alphabet. So Y
X,
and
Y,
Z
Z.
were all in one. But we had and it was a great little thing. And we used that throughout the whole campaign to keep our stuff in alphabetical order. And I have to jump forward a little bit. When we made it to the runoff and beat out Nat Kiefer, Nat wanted to help Dutch defeat Joe DeRosa. And we went over to Nat Kiefer's headquarters, and at that point, he had the most sophisticated operation I'd ever seen. It, computers, everything, to the extent that computers were being used, and he was using computers, mapping out everything. And so after we met and we left, I said to Dutch, I said, how in the hell did we beat those guys? Because they had everything.
Right.
I mean, they had
Except
an
votes.
operation, exactly, except the hearts of the people. They had an operation that was just unbelievable. But anyway, we then started collecting names of people who would agree to participate and get involved, and the campaign gradually took on more visibility. Dutch started interviewing people to bring them in, and we started having people just walk up and wanting to volunteer.
When did you first believe he could win?
The very first time he said it.
Really?
My experience with Dutch is that he had a vision,
Okay.
and he knew what he wanted to do, and I felt like he knew what he could do, and I believed in him from the first time, and I believed in the concept. I had been involved in some politics prior to that, having been a member of Coup and Bowl. I had worked in a number of campaigns, so I knew a little about politics, and I was generally following the trends in voter registration, and I knew that we were building to a point where if we could put the numbers together, we could certainly make it to the runoff and give us a good shot at winning. So I believed from the beginning that he could.
Well, I mentioned when I was talking to Sonyak that he had maybe 4 of us at lunch at the Ward. Must have been in the spring or summer of '76.
Yeah.
And I remember he asked me if I would support him, and I said, well, do you think he could win? He said, well, I haven't decided if I'm going to run yet. But if I decide that I'm running, it's because I believe I could win. And I was pretty impressed with that because I had never thought about it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, he's still on the court, and I knew the election was coming up, but I had never quite thought about it. But once he indicated that he was going to run, I said, well, he must think he could win, and we need to get in here and see what we can do.
Yeah.
But now, you remember he ran for the council at large in '69, and he didn't do as well as some people thought he should have done.
I think there were a couple of factors there. I think the fact that he could not get Moon Landrieu to endorse him, and Moon had the hearts of the people in that election, played into him not winning. I think the fact that he did get an endorsement from Jimmy Fitzmaurice, and Jimmy Fitzmaurice ultimately wound up as the loser.
Right.
And I don't think that the black community at that point in time, as a whole, felt that
He could win.
He could win, and not being the person at the top of the ticket,
Right.
he didn't get as much publicity, and there wasn't as much opportunity for him to talk about things and to pass on the enthusiasm that Dutch had, and to pass on that just strong feeling that he could do it. And so I think he suffered from those things. Primarily, I think the thing that cost him that election was the fact that he could never get Moon Landrieu to endorse him, and therefore he was not on the side that had the momentum going into the election.
But then I remember when he ran for mayor in '77, the first primary, there were a number of strong black leaders who didn't believe he could win and endorse other candidates like Morrison and Kiefer.
That's right.
And there were a lot of blacks, myself included, who were surprised that he came in first. I thought he had a good chance to finish in second. But we were working the streets that day, and I said, you know, we may do better than I thought. We're going to make the runoff. But then just talking to people, there were a lot of people who liked him but didn't believe he could win.
Yeah.
But then once he got in the runoff, and all those people who had split their votes among other candidates realized that he could win, then it became a crusade.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what he realized is that it was one thing for him to believe he could win, and it was one thing for the small group that he surrounded himself with to believe that he could win, but that we had to go out and convince the community that we could win. And we went out and worked we went to everything that you could go to.
Mm-hmm.
We just went, and there wasn't a group too small for us not to go to and let them. And I think it was that buildup over the months leading up to that successful run that he was able to impart to the African American community that not only was he the best candidate in the race, but that he was going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And that positive, really strong positive feeling that you had about him was something that he was able to imbibe people with. And once he did it, the fervor was there. It was like lighting a candle. It wasn't going to go out until it reached the end of the stem. And that's what it did. It turned people on. It got people excited. It got them motivated, and it got them moving in the direction of doing whatever they could. It was a conversation of all of the little clubs, the neighborhood organizations, the local barrooms. Everybody was talking about it, and the prospect of Dutch winning, and what they could do to help. And it was a great time. It was a time where there was a strong feeling of a sense of accomplishment,
Right.
and a sense of empowerment that
Right.
had never existed in our community before. We had, prior to that, had always been the block vote that the white politicians used to either win a race or to defeat someone in the race. But this was a situation where we were going to be able to use the power of the vote to elect one of us for
Right.
the first time to the top position, and it was really exciting.
I remember when I was convinced he could win. I was at that time involved in a process of interviewing the former Chief Justice John Fournet.
Oh,
And we used to go down to the State Supreme Court building on Tuesdays. And by chance, we would always eat with the four liberals. They would always eat together. The three conservatives
yeah.
were not hostile, but they would never
Yeah.
eat with the other four.
Yeah.
And you remember Kiefer filed the lawsuit after the first primary. And we were there, and I never forgot, because I was shocked that they discussed the case in our presence. Warren Billings is the chair of the department now. He was there. And Fournet asked him, how did you decide that case? And Al Tate, who was on the court,
Yeah.
say, well, we threw it out. I say, good. I say, well, suppose there had been theft. Say the coach should never get involved in deciding the election. Put the crooks in jail if they steal votes, but let the people decide their own case. And from that point on, I say, we're going to win this election.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not going to have anything where the court comes in at the last one and disqualifies. Say, we're going to win. We got a momentum moving.
I think the other thing that I've seen about successful campaigns is that when people come into work, they don't particularly care about what it is you ask them to do. They'll do anything.
Right.
And from the top to bottom of that campaign, everyone was willing to do everything. I mean, there were days when we would mop the floors and clean the office. There were days when we were there in business suits.
Lick
doing all kinds of
envelopes.
activity, lick envelopes, stick stamps on them.
Yeah.
Just anything. As I said, we sat in the library of the law office looking up phone numbers for a list so that a poll could be taken. So there were all kinds of things that we would do, and there just was no limit. The energy and the excitement was there, and people didn't want to go home.
Yeah.
They would come to the campaign office, and they just want to keep working until we got it done. And it didn't matter how much had to be done. The folks were there to do it, and they enjoyed doing it, and we were having a good time, and it was very exciting.
So now, after he got elected, what would you consider the most important accomplishment of that first administration?
I think just the fact that he showed the public that it could be done, that an African American could not only get elected, but could serve and be competent in the service, and bring other African Americans into government who could also be competent and manage the city and run the city. I think that opened doors in a way that nothing else that I could think of that could be done could have opened the doors that were open for people like me and other people to ascend to citywide political office.
Now, Sonyak and I had talked about it, and I suspect other people did too. There's no question that he was in the spotlight,
Oh,
continually
absolutely.
scrutinized.
Absolutely.
And yet, there was never even a hint
No.
of a scandal. I mean, that's the thing I found that was
Yeah.
so remarkable.
Yeah.
And I remember him talking to people during the closing stages of that first campaign that when we get in, make some money if you can make it.
Yeah.
But if you steal,
Yeah.
you're going to go to jail.
Well, I think he had a strong moral sense. Dutch had a very strong moral sense. He had a very strong upbringing, from what I can tell, and that moral sense was something that he never abandoned. And it was clear that he wanted his term in office to be a time when people could feel that the doors of government were open and that the opportunities to be successful were open. But under no circumstances was he going to do anything that would violate the law, that would result in recriminations against him. And several of us had been called before grand juries during that first 4 term, including myself. And I know that there were several situations where the federal government was looking at things, but there wasn't anything illegal.
Right.
Not even unethical.
Right.
He was
Did you have any difficulty contacting him after he got to be elected?
Oh, no. In fact, we would go to dinner about 3 times a week during that his term in office. Particularly the second term, once I got elected to a citywide office, we'd usually meet 7 or 8 o'clock, and I'd walk across the street, go into the mayor's office.
He was known for those long, long hours.
Oh yeah. Oh, he was always a worker. He enjoyed it. He just reveled in the position that he held. He had great fun with it. He enjoyed.
He loved doing what he
I
was doing.
sort of compare him to one of the chess masters when it comes to politics.
Right.
Someone like Gary Karpov or somebody like that. I can't think of the other guys' names, but he enjoyed moving the political pieces around on the board, and he was always 3 to 5 steps ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
He knew exactly what the reaction was going to do, and it was just great fun to watch him watch his skill at moving these pieces around and doing exactly what he wanted to do, and then predicting the outcome and then having it happen, just the way he anticipated. He was great at that. He understood people.
Mm-hmm.
He understood personalities. He knew how to deal with people, and he was one of the rare politicians who did not get affected by the power of the office, who was always capable of dealing with the ordinary fella on the street, who never lost his sympathy for the little man, and who never lost his focus.
Mhm.
He understood exactly what it meant for him to hold that position. He understood what the future meant by him having that position, what it meant for the future, and he never lost sight of that.
Were you counseling with him at all during the police strike in '79?
Only to the extent that at that time I was the attorney for the civil sheriff's office, and one of the key things that needed to be done was that the striking policemen had to be served with all of the legal documents that they were, and so I was in touch with them on a daily basis as the policemen were hiding and avoiding service, and we had a team of guys who were out attempting the service. And I'll tell you a funny story about that. Every other day or so, somebody from City Hall would call me and say, "They're at the Ramada." And we'd go racing out, and there would be.
And they were gone.
There. But one day, when we actually got them served, one day,
Now, who did you have to serve? The officers? Or?
all of the officers of the union,
Okay.
because the city, Dutch had brought a lawsuit alleging that the union was in violation of the law and that the strike was illegal, and it was important to get it served so that he could eventually get a judgment against the union, because he wanted to break the union, and the only way he could do that would be to get a judgment against them, and the only way he could move to get a judgment was
serve
to
him.
have them served.
Right.
So we got a phone call from City Hall saying that they were at the Hyatt Hotel right across the street from City Hall. So, and they gave us a particular room on the 3rd floor where there were those small banquet rooms. So we were running around looking in all those rooms. We couldn't find them anywhere. Then I got a call saying, "Go up to the 27th floor." So I go up there in a room on the 27th floor, and they gave room. So we go up. I had 3 guys with me. We go up to the 27th floor. There's nobody there. We come back down. We get on the elevator, and we're coming back down.
And you meet him.
The elevator opens up on the 16th floor, and they're all standing there. So I told the guys, "Throw the papers at them." And we threw the papers at them. "You're served." And then the doors closed.
And that was it.
Yeah. And that's how we served him. It was a great pleasure to go back to the office and call the mayor's office and say we served him.
Well, a lot of people say that was his finest hour.
That was certainly one of his finest hours. I think that another very special occasion for me was when he stood up to the commissioners at Audubon Park.
Ah.
And,
City Park too.
and City Park, yes, and made certain. I mean that those two facilities have a particular negative remembrance in my mind, because as growing up, I lived near it, and we could only go there one day a week to Audubon Park.
Right.
We were prohibited from going to City Park at all.
Right.
And so I never went there, and the way he dealt with those people who were on the board and the ones who lived right adjacent to the park and who acted like the park was part of their yard, I was just so very proud of it. It was one of the proudest moments that I can think of in his administration. It just made me feel good to know that I had participated in him being elected.
It's very interesting because I mentioned that the concern I have about the state legislature with respect to the school board takeover, that I think Dutch would have met that head on. He would have been ahead of them instead of waiting and reacting.
Absolutely.
That the principle, not so much the who's there now, that if you can't fire the people you hired,
that's right,
then you can't be held responsible.
It's very dangerous.
And I think he would have been waiting with a lawsuit
Absolutely.
instead of making a lot of noise.
Yep.
Kept them from taking over City Park and
Yep.
the airport. Say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
these are city properties.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the way it's supposed to work. And again, as you mentioned, probably as a result of his civil rights background,
Yeah.
that this is the way you defeat him in court.
Yep.
That's the one
Yep.
thing that we have on our side when we don't have other
Court.
things. We do have the court on our
Absolutely.
side.
Oh, I think clearly that he would have been there and he would have been involved in that. I think I'm reminded of one other story. You asked me a few minutes ago about when did I think that he could win, and I can tell you that he and I, at least, were so positive about, and I think everybody in the campaign was, but he and I were so positive that he was going to win, that you know how you have to pay these political organizations to
Right.
carry you on their ballot and everything.
Right.
We had gradually strung them out over the length of the campaign because money was coming in very slow, and we did the whole first campaign on $90,000 and finished first. That was unheard of.
Right.
And the last payment was due the Thursday before the election, and I wrote checks for probably $25,000-$30,000, and we didn't have a penny in the bank account. But I was so sure that he was going to win. It didn't matter to me. I knew once he won that
Everybody wants to be with winners.
the money would roll in, and we'd be able to cover those checks. So that's an interesting story that not anyone, but he and I knew about it till now.
But I remember we were working out of Sopatow's house in Lower 9, and there was somebody that came down there, lived in the Lafitte project, and when he found out we weren't paying workers, he'd eaten our donuts and had drunk enough coffee, but he left.
Yeah.
But everybody else stayed.
Oh yeah.
Nobody was looking for any money.
Yeah.
So
No.
this is a cause. This is more than taking somebody's money and
I
don't
think
care whether they win or lose.
I think people had a feeling that they were participating in a history-making event,
Yeah.
and everybody wanted to be part of it, wanted to be able to say to their children, grandchildren, I was part of that.
Yeah.
And it was out of that feeling that we had just strong support and people that we just had. It was a campaign like I've never seen since.
And he never forgot that, because I
Oh, yeah.
remember that he had a lot of support from the black churches.
Mhm.
That remained a big part of his support. He knew how to court the ministers, and they weren't looking for anything except that if they had a little problem with zoning and putting up a board too close to the church, or they needed a street pavement,
Yeah.
he'd write that down. If he had Ron Gordon or somebody there, write that down.
Right.
And suddenly you have a mayor who could take care of things for you, something you didn't have before.
Absolutely. Yeah, someone who had an ear, and not only that, someone who would come and speak at your church.
Yeah.
With regularity. He continued to do that throughout the time he served as mayor.
Did he have anything to do with Joe deciding to run for civil sheriff?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. That's another interesting story. After he got elected, he served 4 years, and of course he asked me if I wanted a job in City Hall, and I said no, I'd prefer to go back to my law practice. So I went back to my law practice, and we as I said, would have dinner on a regular basis and talk about things. And at the time, I was doing the legal work for the sheriff's office, and the sheriff at that point was a 77-year-old man.
Sheriff
named
Starr, huh?
Starr. And Milton came to me one day and said, I don't think I'm going to run again, and would you have any interest in doing it? And I said, sure, I'd be interested, but I said, I want to talk with some people. So the first place I went was the Dutch. I said, what do you think? He said, yeah, we ought to do it. Let's do it. So we started out, and actually my campaign that first time probably mirrored his campaign of 4 years earlier, because I literally campaigned for almost a year before the election, just going to churches, going to social functions, talking to people, building the same kind of network of contacts and support that he had done in his first campaign. So I used that blueprint.
Did you win the first primary?
No, I didn't win in the first.
Okay.
Yeah, I finished first in the first.
But I thought you had won the first
No,
primary.
I had the Hammercourt in the runoff. I faced
Okay.
the runoff, and Dutch was in the runoff as well. If you remember,
I remember
there
against
were-
Ron Fosse.
Right, there were. It was myself against Bob de Hammercourt, Dutch against
Yeah, I do
Ron
remember that.
Fosse,
I
and
remember that now.
Henry Julian against Wimberley, Shirley Wimberley,
Mhm.
and Dutch and I won, and Henry lost.
Right.
And that race, I got more votes than he did.
I remember that now. But I remember
I think
the
that
first
upset him.
primary, it was frigid.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. It was very cold. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
remember
It was-
that.
That was one of our worst winters, but people still came out and voted. But I think that for Dutch, that second election was marred by a lot of negative press from the Times-Picayune and their reporters, and a lot of discontent with the uptowners, some of whom had been with him the first time, and some of it was because of the stances he took on issues like City Park and Audubon
Right.
Park, and just the insistence that city government had to be inclusive. It had to involve all aspects of the community. I mean, prior to Dutch Morial taking office, city government and all of the contracts and business that it did was exclusively with the white community.
Mhm.
And Dutch stood in the door and said, sorry, but this isn't going to happen anymore. There are more people out here who need to be involved in the local government, and made it happen. And people were resentful of that. They were resentful that their little patronage bailiwick that they had had for over 200 years
Mhm.
was now disturbed and disrupted. And I think some of the stuff that we see going on today is a direct result of that, because after Dutch Morial left office, there was sort of a small rolling back of that. And when Mark came in, he tried to stretch it further, and this new guy is even, once again, rolling back some of the advances that we had made during those years. And I think much of what we see today is around those issues.
What do you think he'd be most proud of now if he was still alive?
Most proud?
Mhm.
Well, I think he would certainly be proud of the large numbers of African Americans who have been elected to public office citywide. I think that he would be proud of. I'll tell you one thing that I know he would be proud of. I'll never forget this, and I don't know if anyone else told you this story, but back in '84, when the World's Fair was still on the drawing board, or prior to '84 when it was on the drawing board, Lester Kabikoff owned a wharf right out on the riverfront next to the hotel, and he wanted to put he wanted to convert that wharf into a convention center. And Dutch had a different vision, and a better vision, which was to build a new
Convention center.
state of the art, so that it wouldn't have all of the pillars and posts that a wharf has in it, and would be a solid foundation. And I think he would be very proud of that accomplishment, specifically because at some point during the battle in the legislature on that, Lester Kabikoff wrote him a little handwritten note, about 3 lines. It says, "Over my dead body will you ever get an independent convention center not using my wharf." And Dutch used to keep it in his desk drawer. And anytime he was talking to somebody, he'd pull it out and he said, "Look at that note he wrote me." He'd show it to you, and then he put it back in his drawer. So I think he would be very pleased with that accomplishment. I would have to say that that's probably the crowning achievement.
So you think it's not misplaced to have his name there?
Oh,
That he really
absolutely
was.
not. I think he was in fact the driving force behind that. He understood that. He brought Tony Mumphrey in, who had a comprehension of the UDAG grants at the time, and who put together the money that was needed in order to do the UDAG grants to start that process. I think clearly Dutch had a vision and realized that tourism and conventions was going to be a major part of the economic future of this community if we were going to survive. Here again, way before anyone at the port or in the oil industry could even see what was coming down the road. And thank God we had it. But just think about what New Orleans would have been if we had not had that convention center. And so I think it's aptly named. It should always stay that way. And because but for his vision, we would have a little small wharf on the water with
But nobody coming because it would be too small for
exactly,
any
it'd
of
be
the
too small to do
conventions.
anything, and you wouldn't have been able to use it to wrap the World's Fair around so that you could build the whole, what is it, 14, 15 block convention center that we have there now.
And continuing to grow.
The catalyst that ultimately grew that whole area into what it is today. I think that from an economic standpoint, that would be his crowning achievement.
Well, one that's not as big but proved to be successful is the French Quarter Festival.
Oh, absolutely.
That was his
brainchild. Totally his, yeah. Yeah, the French Quarter Fest. Dutch just had a great love for the city. He loved New Orleans like I don't know anybody who loved it as much as he did. And he loved the French Quarter. He loved every neighborhood. He loved the neighborhoods. He loved the mixes, the people. You know, he loved the culture. He loved everything about the neighborhoods and the way. In fact, when he was mayor, he was the one who started with the neighborhood programs and organizing everything in city government by neighborhoods, so that
he invented Black Pearl.
Yeah, so that you could more effectively deal with the problems in each of those areas in the city. I think he was. There are a number of areas where we're still living the legacy that he created, and very successfully so.
Any negatives?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't have any.
Any final comments you want to make about his legacy? Where would you put him in terms of the mayors under whom you've lived in New Orleans?
I'd put him at the top.
At the top.
I'd put him at the top.
Okay.
I'd put him first. I'd put Moonlanders second.
Okay.
But I think he, far and above the rest of them, would be at the top. He is, his vision, his ability to bring people together, his intellect, his ability to deal with the legislature, which at a lot of situations was a contentious body when he was there.
But he knew how to win.
He knew how to win. And just his positive attitude. I remember one of the things we had as a lapel piece was a little thing that said attitude.
I remember that.
And he had a positive attitude about everything in life. He never felt that there was anything he couldn't accomplish.
I remember I was on the steering committee of the first French Quarter Festival, and after the first one, we thought it was pretty good, and we asked him to come in and critique it. We were so proud, and he tore it apart very constructively. Things that we hadn't thought about. That if we had not made some good course corrections, it never would have gone in the same direction. But he was able to look at it and say, well, no, I don't think this is quite what you had in mind. It looks good now, but when you think back and reflect, maybe if we had done this way. So I understand this is the first time, but next time is going to be better, and in the future is going to be better and better. And I hear people come here and say, I much prefer the French Quarter Festival to the Jazz Fest.
Yeah.
Because it's small and it's self-contained, and you have the sense that you can participate in all of it. You don't have to choose. You don't feel that you're missing anything.
Yeah. No, he was great.
Any final comments?
I just think it from my political experience, it was probably one of the greatest things that I've ever been involved in, was my ability to be involved in this campaign, to help him achieve the election to the office of mayor. It was great from a personal level. It was interesting, exciting,
It was a
fun.
crusade.
It was a crusade.
Keep the drive
Keep the
alive.
drive alive,
Keep the
absolutely.
ball going.
Yep. Without, had I never been elected to anything, it would still be one of the great experiences in my life. But it has become even greater by the fact that I have personal rewards as a result of the fact that I've been elected for 23 years as a civil sheriff in Orleans Parish. The fact that I was able to get elected, because quite frankly, other than Lombard, I was the third African American to get elected in
The
city of
citywide.
New Orleans citywide.
Yep.
And for many years held the record for having the largest white voter turnout at that time on my side of the ledger. So,
And for many years, you were the only black sheriff. How many are there now?
Yeah.
3?
no, just one other.
I thought we had a second
No,
one.
no.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a second one, yeah.
Well, I mean, I thought we had a third.
No, there's Victor Jones
yeah.
up in North Louisiana.
Right, I know about Victor, but I thought there was a third.
No, there was a guy who ran, but he lost in,
Okay.
I can't remember what parish it was.
So we have 3 DAs?
Yeah.
Okay, so that must be what I was thinking about.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yep.
Well, we've come a long ways, we'll have a much longer way to go.
Yeah, oh, and with this, is that still on?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't want to say anything about it.
Well, yeah, I'll turn it off.
Oh, we finished?
Unless you have something more you want to add. I mean, you were so smooth, you jumped right in. I didn't even have to prep you.